Så mycket.
All right. Välkomna. Welcome. We're going to do this in English today. And warm welcome to this panel debate in the lead up to the Summit of the Future. Both to all of you here at the UN Pavilion in Almedalen, but also to all of you following online today. My name is Stina Andebjer, and I will guide you through today's discussion. We will hear from these eminent experts I have with me to make sense of this upcoming Summit of the Future and discuss what's really at stake. And with me today I have Jan Eliasson, diplomat, former Deputy Secretary General to the UN, former Foreign Minister in Sweden, and among a lot of honorable titles.
Everything is former.
We also have Britannia Kasaye, who's the Sweden's youth representative to UN's high-level political forum for sustainable development. And then last but not least, Arvin Gadgil, director for Global Policy Center for Governance. Warm welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
So the world is changing rapidly. We have complex challenges such as climate change, democratic backsliding, conflicts, and increased polarization that's creating cracks in our existing ways of cooperating. And despite the fact that our societies are so tightly interlinked and interconnected, the gaps are increasing both within and between countries. And this is the backdrop and a bit of the background to the upcoming Summit of the Future in New York in September, where the UN Secretary General has invited world leaders, experts, policymakers, advocates to rethink what multilateralism and global cooperation means in this changing world. And it's an important opportunity for the world to lay the foundations for more effective global cooperation that can deal with the challenges today, but also those that lay ahead of us in the future. And we already have the what, the form of many existing agreements and commitments, starting with the UN Charter, which Jan Eliasson has in his back pocket. We also have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement. So now, Summit of the Future, and with the leadership of the UN Secretary General, is really to again look at the how. How do we cooperate better to deliver on these shared aspirations and goals, and how can we better meet the needs of the present while also preparing for the future. So this is what we're going to discuss over the next 30 minutes or so. And I'm going to start with you, Jan. From your perspective, what are the most pressing issues that the world needs to collectively address today?
First of all, glad to see you all, and glad we have this forum to meet, and that we prove the point that the most important word in this world is the word together, tillsammans, världens viktigaste ord. When I was president of the General Assembly 2005 and 2006, I was very proud in a formula that we presented and which was fully received by all member states, surprisingly. And that formula is, there is no peace without development, but there is no development without peace, and there is neither peace nor development without respect of human rights. In other words, we have to have, in order to have a good development in today's world, peace, development, and human rights simultaneously. Not one after the other, but simultaneously to reinforce each other. That's the model. And unfortunately, Stina, I must say, we are in pretty bad shape. We are in bad shape. I don't have to repeat the horrors of Sudan and Gaza and Ukraine and so forth. And how frustrating it is not to see progress on the climate and environmental issues. And of course the backsliding in human rights on several fronts, and also, I must admit, on democracy. So we are in a situation where I think we need a mobilization of resources, and I think we need to have a mindset where we both are realistic about the difficulties in today's world, and we cannot deny them. But we must also have a direction to go, a framework, something which is beyond today's world. We have to build a credible, good future, which is more and more difficult. So I always said to my colleagues at the UN when I was Deputy Secretary General that you have to divide your work into, or thinking into, two categories. One, the world as it is, and don't put on rosy glasses for that. Do a good, solid, sober analysis. But then you must never forget the world as it should be. And we who believe in the UN, we have an uphill battle explaining and even defending, rightly so in some cases, the record of the UN. But there are ways to improve, and there are ways to move ahead, which I think we will return to. But this, as an introduction, I would just point to the fact that it is a pretty difficult road we have. We should accept that, but we should never lose sight of what are the goals of this UN Charter. And by the way, you all know the first three words of the Charter, don't you? The first three words of this Charter is, we the peoples. We the peoples. It's not we the governments, or we international organizations. It's we the people. And that's what some people have forgotten in today's world today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan.
Should we clap?
We can clap. Thanks. Moving over to you, Britannia. Today's half of the world's population is under the age of 30, which is quite a staggering fact. Youth and future generations are rightly a key focus at the upcoming Summit of the Future. So, as a youth representative to the UN, I wanted to ask you about what your hopes and expectations are for this upcoming summit.
Yes. So, I mean, I welcome the emphasis and the importance that the Summit of the Future puts on youth, and that we have a whole youth chapter and all that. But the problem is not only, I mean, involving the youth and talking about the youth. And I mean, in the chapter it also emphasizes on we have to put in education, and we have to finance education for children and youth in I mean, the developing country, or what some people call the global south. But that's not only the only problem. I mean, even having education and all the resources, youth are always engaged, and always engaged in international problems and in social injustices. The problem is actually having a meaningful inclusion, and that's what I hope to see, that the Summit of the Future will result in a pact where we not only talk about that we need involvement of youth, but that we focus on how we can actually have meaningful inclusion of youth. And I know that they also in this latest revision of the Summit of the Future, the latest draft, they talk about meaningful inclusion in national level and also in the UN level. And I mean, I can speak from my own experience, but also from other UN youth delegates I talk to around the world. And starting with the national level, I mean, it's fantastic how far we have come. That so many countries can send youth to the UN, and that we talk about youth inclusion. But there's still not a long-lasting and strong institutionalization of youth voices, not even in Sweden, which has been leading in that question. And in order to have an actual meaningful youth inclusion, as a youth, and many youth know that this is something we do in our free time. We have school and we have work, and if we don't have real funding and if we don't have a political will, then only having us at the table won't really make a difference. And it's something we like to call youth washing, that many of you may be familiar with. And also at the UN level, I mean, so let's say we have the funding and we send youth to the UN and we are there. There's still this problem of which youth are there, since not all countries want to send youth over there, and then even if they have the money, there's a visa problem for some youth in some countries. There's, I mean, problem of even getting into some rooms. I mean, even physically, you can't get into all of the rooms at the UN as a youth representative. So, and also if you're there and you are involved, there is not always follow-ups, and you might be there and, I mean, write reports as youth and put up your thoughts and your experiences, but then there is no follow-up, and then there is no one who really tries to change anything. So I hope to see actual work being done, and I hope to actually see youth at the summit, because it would be quite embarrassing to have a summit of the future without any youth there.
Oh, definitely. And Arvin, I know that you have some thoughts around this as well, so I might let you comment a little bit, and then also throw another question at you. As director of the Unity Global Policy Center for Governance, if you could also share with us some, innovative governance models or practices that you've come across in your work that could possibly be, used or discussed in order for us to better sort of address the challenges that we face both now and going forward.
Yeah, and thanks a lot, Sina. Thank you to both of you. I mean, that's what a way to start. And I have to say, Jan, it feels almost surreal to be here on this stage with you. I've been following your career really closely from afar. This is the first time we meet, and I feel a little bit starstruck. So I just have to, calm my nervousness. Let me start where you started, Jan, and then we'll talk a little bit about youth washing and youth inclusion later. But let's just take one step back and talk about what this is about, Summit of the Future. Summit of the Future is not just a gimmick. It is really the first proper attempt at rethinking our multilateral system. And if you think about it, it's a really brave effort, right? Because we know what you were talking about, Sina. It's an incredibly challenging global context at the moment, where countries are at loggerheads for all sorts of things. And of course, if you're going to reform the multilateral system, you need some sort of agreement. But at the moment, it seems like agreement is, difficult to come by. So why launch this enormous reform thinking, or reform effort right now? And I think the Secretary General will tell you that we don't have a choice. I mean, if you go back to 1944, the San Francisco conference, towards the end of 1944, there were 51 countries in that meeting. Now, there are 193, 192 countries represented in the General Assembly. It's an entirely different world. At that time, it was a post-war situation with all sorts of different challenges, but at least it was possible to align what were the real challenges for humanity, and it was summarized in the Charter of the United Nations, which Jan has in his back pockets. I think I should learn from that. I need to bring my own physical edition. But now we are, we are exposed to troubles and problems and threats that are so intertwined and so complex that they don't even compare to what it was like in 1944. So that's the effort here, right? It's not just another summit. It's not just another meeting. It is this grand question about how do we, as an international community, have any chance of solving these things together till summons without actually finding the right system that is fit to do it. So the Summit of the Future has a grand name and has grand ambitions, but I'd like us all to think about, everyone who's found their way here, which may mean indicate that you're interested in international issues, to use this as a platform to start these conversations about what do we need together till summons as an international community to solve these things. And at first when people ask me that question, I feel a bit taken aback because it's almost impossible to attack it, right? It's such a big question. How do we do that? That's exactly why the Summit of the Future is your gift, because you can take it as a whole idea, or you can parcel it into the different work streams and ask questions on each of them. So in a way, what the Secretary General has done is make it easier for you to have your conversations around the dinner table and your organizations about what is really the way that we should organize our international community together. So that's what this is about. And just quickly on youth inclusion. So I think you're right. I mean, there isn't any best practice on this in the United Nations system, and Jan would know more about this than I. But but it's not, and it's not out of, you know, this motivation of the Secretary General. The way I read it is not about being nice to youth, right? It's not about being kind and generous and, you know, say, you know, we want to youth the United Nations. It is about realizing that it is impossible to design actually include in the decision of the path that lead to that future. And it's not about just being, you know, just being heard. It's about making actual decisions together with global decision makers. This is I believe this is you know, if the ambition is followed through by member states, this is truly groundbreaking youth inclusion potential. And I hope that everyone can see that potential, engage in it, and particularly youth-based organizations all around the world. Yeah,
Thank you.
I can go to innovation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Come back to that. I'll turn back to you, Jan, and given your extensive experience, I must say, in global corporations at many different levels, I wanted to hear from you what your sort of most significant lessons learned, and maybe specifically how they sort of could be applied in addressing this deadlock that we kind of see now.
Yeah, I don't want to diminish in any way the problems. As I said, we live in a world where we really have to take on new attitudes. And if I look back at my diplomatic life, I was filled with optimism from more or less the first start of school in Gothenburg, Sweden. We were seeing, after this horror of the Second World War and the Holocaust and Stalinism and so forth, we saw a new future being designed. UN Charter in San Francisco, the Human Rights Declaration 48, and the Refugee Conventions 51, Geneva Conventions, Coal and Steel Union, which later became European Union. My whole life was seeing positive movements around both cooperation and democracy and human rights. Now I see a trend for the last 5-6 years in particular where mistrust has been the key word. Mistrust between nations, and don't even speak about the mistrust between the great powers, US, Russia and China. But the new thing for me is the deep distrust inside nations. That we look for people to blame or reasons inside for protests against each other. And this mistrust factor is the biggest one. So what do? Well, to me, the Summit of the Future could very well come up with great ideas on, for instance, improving the veto situation, General Assembly taking on a stronger role, Secretary General given more of a role, Article 99 here and so forth. But I think some main issues which have to do with the way we look at international cooperation would be needed. I think we need to come to the conclusion that the good international solution, how about climate Paris Agreement 2015? The good international solution is a national interest. If we can take away the false line between domestic progress and international progress, and see international progress as important for your nation, for your life, so that they don't just point to the UN as idealists, you know, living up there in the sky, but that this really is of relevance to us at home. And for that to happen, I think the work has to change inside the UN and also for all of us, because we haven't quite learned to solve problems together. We, in our bureaucracies, in our companies, in the UN, in government, I say for myself, we work in silos. And we think that we can solve the problems in that silo. We can't. In today's world, as you said, I mean, these are so complicated that you need to see it from several directions. So, in the mobilization around the work of the UN family, and thanks for the UN family for coming together as you have here, you have to make sure that you bring in the parliaments, the political life, that you bring in the civil society, which is under difficult conditions in Sweden right now, by the way, that you bring in the private sector, that you bring in the media, and you put the problem in the center. The problem in the center, and a glass of water is certainly a problem, I can tell you. And then you ask who can do something about it. And then you gather and you come to a division of labor. That's how you solve problems. That's what the UN has to bring out at this meeting, I hope, to bring in the collective capacity of power that exists inside the organization, but also bring in other actors, because we all feel, don't we, something has to be done. We need to have the mobilization of good forces now and reduce this mistrust factor and start to come up with practical, concrete ideas. And I give you some of them in this form, but there are more details and there are also more panelists.
No, thank you. Following up on that, actually, and a little bit also what you spoke to previously, Britannia, in terms of youth washing, wanted to go back a bit to you to also reflect on sort of what would you like to see in terms of international institutions to better actually, to create meaningful action, meaningful engagement of youth in these, both of the processes at these high-level forums, but also in the lead-up to them, and maybe more importantly after.
Yes, if I could just quickly say that it was super interesting to listen to you guys speak and very inspiring. And if I can just quickly touch upon one thing Jan said about growing up in a world where the UN was, there was a future that we were looking forward to. And it's so interesting, the contrast of like my adult life, since like I'm 23, and the many people in my surroundings are very mistrusting about global cooperation. And I know that Sweden, they have this thing called ungdomsbarometern, where they research and how do you say do a survey, exactly, thank you, of how you think and act. And there is a trend, a really quick trend, where youth are becoming more and more, egocentric, I can say. And there you can see a mirroring in global context. In Europe at least, countries becoming more and more nationalistic. So I really want to feel the kind of optimism you guys feel about the summit. And I think it's a very good thing that we have this sense. As you said, the UN was created, almost 80 years ago, and the people who created the UN was the winners of the Second World War, and now we have so many more countries involved. And there's very little room for developing countries in many of the UN institutions, and even less room for youth in these countries. But going back to your question, I think I touched upon some of the points before, but of course we need to have resources. We need to have actually someone who wants to put in the funding, because I do see when I went to the UN last year, there were many people in many institutions, UN institutions, who wanted youth inclusion. But then we had these meetings, but then it just fell through because we didn't have any funding. We can't put down full-time effort into work when we have no money and we have other stuff going on, school and work. So that's one crucial point, and that's me speaking from Sweden. I feel it's even more crucial for other youths in other parts of the world. And also we need, as I said before, institutionalization. We have, in Finland we have a youth office in the government, under their prime minister. And in Iceland they have a youth and children office. And that's another point that we need to talk about, children inclusion and not only youth inclusion. And also at the UN level, we have the UN delegate program. We have major groups of children and youth, but as you also talked about the Security Council, there's not much youth inclusion there, and it's very hard even to begin talking about reforming the Security Council. It's going to be a big topic for the summit future. So maybe it's something to talk about in the future, how to include youth even there. And also just, accessibility in general, being able to take part in the UN rooms, stuff like visa and preparations. But starting also I talked to my friend about this, the mistrust, and many youth talking about UN not having any real power, and you should more focus on the national level. And we talked about it, but we said it's still very, very impressive, and it's very cool that we even have a platform where countries come together and speak. Even if there's no decision making being done, that we meet and talk about these topics in itself is very, very cool, like if you think about it. And I mean, talking about youth inclusion and having that like as a norm, and non-youth inclusion as an exception, I mean, that in itself would push more countries to prioritize that.
Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Sorry,
No, you.
okay. No, there's some very, very interesting things there. So for me, first of all, let's think of the United Nations not as an organization, but as an idea. And I think that's, what Jan was also saying, that the United Nations is first and foremost an idea. If we didn't have the United Nations, we would have the Nations United or something else like that, which was also United Nations, right? So the point is still that we need a place to meet, to discuss as countries of the world difficult questions. In addition to that, the United Nations has evolved, right? It has an implementing arm, like the organization I'm working in, this United Nations Development Program, and it has a norm-making role that it agrees together on resolutions of the General Assembly or the Security Council, and thereby sets global norms. It has a rule-making, task as well, and it also has a knowledge-making task. And all of these tasks come together and make the United Nations. So I think it's important to think about United Nations, and of course, the assembly piece is it's in the center of all of that. So when we talk about the United Nations, it's really nothing to talk about. The United Nations is an idea. It is the different pieces of the United Nations we need to look at and how we reform it. And I think that bit is a bit lost on people quite often. And one more thing that I am eager to underline is that, I mean, people might think that United Nations is a very large system, and it is, right? It's got 32 funds and programs, all the UNICEFs and UNDPs and the World Health Organization, all of that is part of that family of entities. It has 120,000 peacekeeping troops all around the world. It has more than 200 offices and headquarters and lots of systems. But if you add the cost of all of that together on an annual basis, so again, 120,000 peacekeeping troops that is keeping peace in many, many countries, and all of these organizations all put into one, is less than half of a national budget of Sweden. Less than half of a national budget of Sweden. The entire system. That is also important for us to understand, right? So when we talk about what the UN is, we need to understand its functions, its roles, its size, and its potential. My claim would be at the moment that the problem is partially that the investment in this common system is not big enough. And it's not necessarily because the UN should do everything, it's just that the UN should do those things which are difficult to do by countries by themselves. And at the moment we are not doing that efficiently enough. And that's one of the key messages that I think this process will bring out, is that you won't have an international system unless you invest in it. It does actually cost money. Okay, just quickly on this thing about innovation and governance and trust, because I think it's an interesting piece, right? To what extent does what we call, horizontal trust and vertical trust between people and their authorities and between people themselves impact on global cooperation? And what we do know is that, one of the numbers that really scare me the most is that horizontal trust globally, we ask in UNDP, we ask a lot of people around the world on an annual basis, to what extent they trust other people. And at the moment, if you ask that question, less than 30% of the population of the world generally trust other people. Less than 30%. That is a 10 percentage point fall from 10 years ago. It's a drastic reduction in our ability to trust someone on the street. Now, what does that do? Another fact, 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 7 people in the world feel insecure about the future. Now that's a personal tragedy. If you feel insecure about the future, it's terrible, right? You don't know what's going to happen with your life or with your loved ones' lives. But what happens on a societal level when 6 out of 7 people feel insecure? Well, what we know is that they will select policies that they think will make them secure in the short run. In the short run. And that's the key word here when we talk about reforming the UN system, is that, of course, many of the issues and problems that we have as a human race today requires us to invest in the short run for long-term benefit. But as I just said, people around the world have a lack of vertical trust, and horizontal trust, but also vertical trust, which disallows them to think in that way or accept the risk of investing, saying, okay, it's fine, we won't get what we need today as long as we get it into the future, because they feel insecure about today. And it's a perfectly natural and logical response, but it is an almost overwhelming policy challenge for the United Nations system, which is built on this idea to overcome collective action and make sure that we make decisions for the long run.
Good.
We have a few minutes left. I wish we could go on for longer, and we have actually received a question from the audience ahead of the seminar, which I wanted to pose to all of you. I've adjusted it a little bit to make sure that we have time. But the question is, if you could share the one most important action to take now to really sort of initiate concrete change. I want to start with you, Jan.
Prevention. See the problem early on. Feel the vibrations in the ground when the danger comes, and act on the early stages of conflict. Don't let the wars erupt. Don't let the destruction of nature go beyond a certain limit. Don't let human rights move into torture and civil war. So the biggest call I have is call for prevention. A real challenge to the young ones here: find out different ways of preventing conflicts from erupting, from the development to be stagnating and to human rights to be violated. That's the most important one.
Thank you.
And then I would add still diplomacy. I feel a tremendous deficit of diplomacy in today's world. The military solutions are a la mode. No one calls in mediators anymore. Military solutions are the ones to go for. Military coups are very popular in Africa. All over the place we forget that we should talk, that we should have a conversation on issues before they explode in our face. But that's also prevention, so I come back.
Yeah, prevention summarized it well. Thank you. And you, over to you, Betania, then you, Arvin, you have around 1 minute each.
Yes, okay, so I can be very quickly on this one. I agree with Annelies, and diplomacy is very important. And in diplomacy, I would also say trust. That goes hand in hand. In order to mediate, in order to, I mean, you know better than me, there requires a lot of trust. And also, as you mentioned before, trust between people as well as trust between people and institutions, since that's something there's a lack of from youth. So that's something that we need.
Thank you. Finally, Arden.
Yes, just I want to leave people with a bit of a positive feeling here, because as the previous president of General Assembly, you will know this, Jan. Every year, the General Assembly negotiates on 200 resolutions. 200 pieces of text that all governments that are members of the General Assembly have to agree on. And every year, almost all of them are agreed on. Now the question is, of course, how much does it matter? But the point is still, there is agreements. There's systematic agreement across the world on hundreds of issues. So let's keep that in mind. For me, the one thing I'll be looking for is leadership for dignity. And let me just explain. Leadership is missing in this field of what Jan is a master of. Talking about human dignity as something that is difficult and complex and right. Not just something that is like a rosy Barbie movie type thing that looks like window dressing, but it is an actual task, an actual challenge for us. So leadership for dignity, there's too few leaders who put dignity for everyone at the center of their policy making.
Thank you. One last sentence.
Well, since Arvin mentioned the need to also bring in elements of hope, since I have turned from an optimist to a worried optimist, but not yet a pessimist who has not yet given up. So I'm in the worried optimist category. But the hope factors for me are very strong and structural. I have 4 main reasons for hope. 1, women. Women's emancipation, women's liberation. It hasn't yet happened. It is happening. It will happen and will have a tremendously positive impact, economically, socially, psychologically, everything. It's coming in spite of what you see in Afghanistan and other places. 2, youth. When we learn to work with you people, with young people, not only for young people, but with young people early on. Go and speak to 11, 12-year-old kids, and they know the right answers on environment and peace and right and wrong and truth and falsehood. So work with and make sure that you run with the baton, the democratic baton. Someone has to do it. Can't have war games in the future on the computer. The third reason for hope is knowledge, science, research. Everything we can do to make sure these 17 goals can be achieved. A lot of thinking and make Sweden a knowledge nation. And the last, not the last hope, of course, the fourth hope, international cooperation. And still the ideals of the UN, what it stands for. And stand up for it. Don't let anyone bring you down. Because the world as it is we have the same analysis. But the world as it should be. If we forget that, then we leave up to the forces that Arvind described, who use fear for the future to bring in the simple solutions, and unfortunately the division of people into different categories. And that could hurt us very much. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you. Yes. Thank you to all three of you so much. We could have gone on for a lot longer, and maybe more importantly, thank you to everyone in the audience, and also to you joining online. And yeah, enjoy the rest of Almedalen. Thanks.
Du ska stanna kvar här. Just wait, we'll take a quick photo.
Ja, säg att jag fortsätter.
Oh.